3 a.m. Stop that shook the NBA? James Harden did not wake up the NBA with a buzzer beater, a trade demand, or a playoff meltdown this time. He woke it up with a mugshot. At 3:41 inches the morning in Houston, according to court records and multiple reports, one of the most recognizable players of his generation found himself in the middle of a traffic stop that instantly turned into a national headline. Not a finals game, not a press conference, not a contract announcement, just flashing lights, a quiet street, and one detail inside his car that changed the entire conversation around his summer. A handgun was reportedly seen in plain view inside the vehicle. Harden was arrested on a misdemeanor charge of unlawfully carrying a weapon in a motor vehicle, booked before sunrise, and later released after posting bond. Legally, this may not be the kind of case that ends a career, but in the NBA, perception can move faster than any court process. And once that mugshot hit the internet, the story was no longer just about a chart. It became about James Harden's reputation, his future, his contract, and the uncomfortable question fans have been whispering for years. Is this finally the moment where the league stops seeing Harden as a star worth the drama? That is what makes this situation so explosive. Harden is not some random bench player trying to stay in the league. This is a former MVP, a scoring champion, a man who once bent defenses until they looked helpless. In Houston, he was not just great. He was the entire show. The step back three, the beard, the isolation game, the free throws, the nightly 30-point explosions. For years, Harden made basketball look like a private language only he understood. But that version of Harden feels far away now. Now he is 36 years old, facing a court date, surrounded by contract uncertainty, and attached to another headline that makes front offices pause. The Cavaliers have to ask themselves a question they probably never wanted to ask this loudly. How much talent is worth? How much risk? Because this is not just about one night in Houston. This is about everything that came before it. The playoff disappointments, the trade demands, the broken partnerships, the public fight with Daryl Morey, the slow decline from unstoppable superstar to complicated veteran, and now one more image for critics to attach to his name. So before we decide whether this is being overblown or whether this is the beginning of the end, we need to walk through what actually happened, why the timing is brutal, and why this one arrest may have landed at the worst possible moment of Harden's career. And I want to know where you are watching from right now. Drop your city or state in the comments. If you think Harden can still rebuild his image and finish his career strong, press 1. If you think this is the moment NBA teams finally start backing away, press 2. And if you follow NBA drama, trades, scandals, and the stories behind the headlines, subscribe now, because this Harden story is only getting started. The detail that changed everything. The most dangerous part of this story is not just the charge itself, it is how small the detail was. Because according to the reports, this was not a high-speed chase. This was not some wild confrontation outside an arena. It was not Harden standing in the middle of a nightclub surrounded by chaos. It was a traffic stop in Houston before sunrise, the kind of moment that usually disappears before breakfast. But when police noticed the weapon in plain view, everything changed. One object, one placement, one missing layer of caution, and suddenly a routine night became a national NBA controversy. That is why this story hit so hard. In legal terms, the case may be manageable. A misdemeanor charge, a bond, an attorney, a court date. Harden has the money, the representation, and the public status to fight this carefully. But the court of public opinion does not move with the same patience as the legal system. Fans did not wait for every fact. Shows did not wait for a final ruling. Social media did not wait for context. Once people saw the words, James Harden arrested, the story was already moving faster than he could control. And that is the real problem. Harden's career has reached a point where every mistake carries extra weight. If this had happened 10 years ago, when he was destroying defenses in Houston and putting up video game numbers, the reaction might have been different. People might have said it was a bad night, a legal issue, something to handle and move past. But now, at this stage of his career, everything becomes part of a bigger pattern. A mugshot does not erase an MVP trophy, but it can change the way people talk about a player. It gives critics a new image. It gives front offices another question. It gives sponsors another meeting. It gives fans another reason to debate whether the player they are watching is still worth the noise around. For Harden, the issue is not whether he can survive this. He probably can. The issue is whether this moment makes every future negotiation colder, every team meeting more cautious, every offer a little smaller than it would have been before. Because in the NBA, talent gets you paid. but trust keeps you wanted. Houston was not just a city. Houston makes this story feel heavier. If this had happened in a city where Harden had no history, it would still be a headline. But Houston is different. Houston was the place where James Harden became James Harden. It was the city that gave him the ball, the system, the freedom, and the state. It was where he stopped being the sixth man from Oklahoma City and became one of the most terrifying offensive forces the league had ever seen. For years, Houston did not just watch Harden. Houston lived through him. Every step-back three felt like a signature. Every 40-point night felt normal. Every defender reaching, stumbling, and looking helpless became part of the show. The Rockets built their identity around him, and the city embraced the beard, the confidence, the swagger, the nightlife, the whole package. That is why the image of Harden being booked in Houston feels so strange. It is almost poetic in the wrong way. The same city that once watched him rise now became the backdrop for one of the most uncomfortable moments of his public life. Houston remembers the peak, the packed arena, the MVP chants, the nights when Harden walked onto the floor and made every possession feel like a trap for the defense. But Houston also remembers the ending, the tension, the trade demand, the conditioning questions. The feeling that one of the greatest relationships in modern NBA history did not end with a championship parade, but with frustration on both sides. That is what makes this arrest feel bigger than a legal incident. It landed in the city that carries the full Harden memory, the greatness, the disappointment, the pride, and the regret. Houston knows better than anyone what he was. And maybe that is why the mugshot feels so jarring. It does not just show a player in trouble. It shows the distance between the Harden who once owned that city and the Harden now fighting to control the final chapters of his career. The cruelest part is that Harden still belongs to Houston in some emotional way. Even after all the jerseys changed, even after Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and Cleveland, Houston remains the place people connect to his name first. So when the news broke there, it did not feel random. It felt like the past had finally caught up to him. The MVP version, America couldn't stop watching. There was a time when James Harden did not need forgiveness. He only needed the ball. During his Houston prime, Harden was not just an all-star. He was an entire offensive system wearing a jersey. Everything started with him, everything bent toward him. The spacing, the pace, the shooting, the free throws, the isolation possessions, the step-back threes that made defenders look like they had been pushed by an invisible force. Harden did not play fast like Russell Westbrook. He did not overpower people like LeBron James. He did something colder. He slowed the game down until everyone else looked desperate. That was the version of Harden America could not stop watching, even when people claimed they hated the style. They complained about the fouls. They complained about the dribbling. They complained about the step back, but they still watched because every night carried the possibility of something ridiculous. 50 points, 60 points, a triple-double that looked fake, a scoring streak that made the regular season feel like a one-man experiment. In 2018, Harden reached the top of the mountain, MVP, 65 wins, the best record in the league. A Rockets team built to challenge the Warriors at their absolute peak. For a moment, it felt like the basketball world was about to shift. Golden State had the dynasty, but Houston had the formula. And Harden was the engine. That is what makes the decline so painful to watch. Because this is not a player who was only famous. This is not someone who was overrated by marketing. Harden's greatness was real. The numbers were real. The fear he created was real. Coaches lost sleep trying to solve him. Defenders played him from the side because guarding him normally felt impossible. The league changed rules and habits around the way he attacked. But greatness creates its own burden. Once people have seen you at that level, they never forget it. They compare every later version of you to the monster you used to be. So when Harden now scores a quiet 19, or fades in a playoff game, or appears in a headline for something off the court, the contrast becomes brutal. Fans are not just reacting to who he is now, they are grieving who he used to be. And that is why this story cuts deeper than another NBA scandal. It is the fall of a man who once made the impossible look routine. The playoff shadow that never left. For all of Harden's regular season brilliance, one shadow kept following him. The playoffs. That is the part of his career that never stayed quiet. Every superstar has bad games. Every legend has nights they wish they could erase. But Harden's problem was that the wrong nights kept happening at the wrong time. And the NBA never forgets when greatness disappears under the brightest lights. Houston came painfully close. The Rockets pushed Golden State to the edge. They had the Warriors vulnerable. They had the system, the defense, the shooting, the MVP, the momentum. Then came the missed threes, the empty possessions, the collapse that became part of NBA history. One game does not define a career by itself, but that night became a permanent exhibit in the case against Harden. After that, every playoff exit added another layer. It did not matter how great he looked from November to March. It did not matter how many defenders he embarrassed. The question always returned in April and May. When the game slows down, when referees swallow whistles, when defenses load up, when one possession can change a legacy, can Harden still be the best player on the floor? Sometimes he was. That should be said clearly. Harden has had real playoff moments. He has won games, he has carried teams, he has produced performances that most players could only dream of, but the criticism grew because the failures were louder than the answers. The disappointing games became easier to remember than the solid ones. The quiet fourth quarters became part of the brand. That is the cruel math of superstardom. When you are paid like a legend, judged like a legend, and marketed like a legend, people do not grade you on normal standards. Good is not enough. Solid is not enough. Professional is not enough. Harden was not supposed to be a supporting detail in someone else's championship story. He was supposed to be the reason the story existed. And now, late in his career, every new controversy gets attached to that playoff history. The arrest does not stand alone. It sits next to the missed opportunities, the failed super teams, the tense exits, the moments when Harden looked close to winning everything but never actually did. That is why people are asking if this is the end. Not because of one charge, but because the patience around Harden has been thinning for years. The exit pattern begins. The beginning of the second Harden story was not a trade. It was a pattern. When he left Houston, it did not feel like a clean basketball decision. It felt messy, uncomfortable, and strangely personal. The franchise that had built around him could no longer keep the relationship stable. Harden wanted out, and once Harden wanted out, the entire situation became impossible to ignore. The player who had once carried Houston now looked like a man trying to force the door open from the inside. Brooklyn was supposed to fix everything. On paper, it looked unfair. Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, James Harden, 3 offensive geniuses on one roster, 3 players who could create a shot from nothing, 3 stars who, if healthy and connected, should have terrified the league. For a short moment, the Nets looked like the future of the NBA. The highlights were smooth, the spacing was impossible, and the championship talk came immediately. Then reality arrived. Injuries, absences, frustration, chemistry that never had enough time to harden into something real. Harden's body started betraying him. The hamstring issues mattered. His burst was not always there, his scoring was not as automatic, and when Brooklyn became uncomfortable, the same question returned. Would Harden adapt, or would Harden leave? He left. That second exit changed the way the league looked at him. 1 trade demand can be explained. 2 starts to look like a habit. By the time Harden moved from Houston to Brooklyn to Philadelphia, front offices were no longer just evaluating the player. They were evaluating the entire experience of having James Harden in the building. That is a very different conversation because Harden still had value. He could still pass, still control pace, still create offense, but teams had to ask what came with it. Would he be happy if the role changed? Would he accept less control? Would he stay committed if the season got difficult? Would he show up prepared if things did not go his way? These questions did not come from nowhere. They came from history. And once a player's reputation shifts from superstar who wants to win to superstar who might want out, everything becomes more fragile. Every bad loss feels dangerous. Every contract disagreement feels explosive. Every silence feels like a warning. That is the pattern that made the Houston arrest land with such force. It did not create the doubt around Harden. It confirmed the doubt was still alive. Philadelphia, Morey, and the public war. Philadelphia was where the Harden story stopped being complicated and became ugly. The Sixers did not bring him in as a luxury. They brought him in because they believed he could help Joel Embiid win a championship. Embiid was at the peak of his powers, the kind of dominant center who can bend a playoff series by himself. Harden was supposed to be the perfect partner, the veteran guard, the elite passer, the former MVP who could organize the offense and punish every double team. For a while, that vision made sense. Harden was no longer the Houston scoring machine, but he could still run an offense. He could still create angles. He could still make life easier for a superstar big man. The problem was never only basketball. The problem was trust. When the contract situation with Philadelphia turned sour, the private disagreement became public war. Harden did not just leak frustration through sources. He stood in front of cameras overseas and called Daryl Morey a liar. Not once in a quiet hallway, not in a moment where microphones accidentally caught him. He said it clearly, repeated it, and made sure the entire basketball world heard it. That was more than a headline. That was a broken relationship broadcast internationally. And what made it so dramatic was the history between the two men. Morey was not just any executive. He was the man who helped bring Harden to Houston. The man who built an entire franchise identity around his talent. the man who trusted Harden long before he became an MVP. Their partnership had once represented modern basketball innovation. Now it had become a public accusation. For teams watching from the outside, that moment mattered, because front offices know disagreements happen. They know stars get frustrated, they know money creates tension, but when a player is willing to take a private business dispute and turn it into a global media firestorm, every future employer has to imagine that same microphone pointed at them. That is why the Philadelphia chapter damaged Harden so deeply. It was not just that he wanted another trade, it was that the exit became another spectacle. Another bridge burned, another organization left trying to explain how a promising partnership collapsed so quickly. And once again, the same question followed him out the door. Was Harden unlucky, misunderstood, and undervalued? Or was he the common denominator in every ending? The decline no one could ignore. The hardest thing for a superstar to lose is not athleticism. It is denial. For years, James Harden could make the game obey him. If he wanted points, he got to the line. If he wanted space, he created it with a step back. If he wanted control, he dribbled until the defense made one tiny mistake, then punished it. His game was built on skill, rhythm, strength, timing, and a genius understanding of leverage. But time does not negotiate. The free throws started to drop. The first step lost some of its violence. Defenders no longer looked quite as helpless. The step back was still dangerous, but not terrifying in the same way. Harden could still pass at an elite level, still read the floor, still punish mistakes, but the version that could carry an entire offense every night was fading. That is normal for an NBA player in his mid-30s. What made it harder for Harden was everything around the decline. The trade requests, the conditioning questions, the playoff criticism, the public drama, the nightlife stories. When a player ages quietly, fans can accept it with respect. When a player ages while surrounded by controversy, every lost step becomes evident, and yet it would be unfair to pretend Harden became useless. He did not. Even in decline, he remained better than most guards in the league. He could still organize an offense better than younger, faster players. He could still create a good shot late in the clock. He could still make a team more intelligent. That is why organizations kept taking the call. That is why contracts still appeared. That is why contenders still wondered if maybe in the right role, with the right structure, Harden could help. But the price had changed. Teams were no longer buying the MVP. They were buying the memory of the MVP, plus whatever remained. And that is a dangerous market for a proud superstar, because the player remembers the peak more clearly than anyone. Harden knows what it felt like to be unstoppable. He knows what it felt like when the league had no answer. So when teams treat him like a risk instead of a franchise centerpiece, that has to sting. The arrest in Houston landed on top of that emotional reality. It arrived at a time when Harden needed stability, not another reason for people to question him. He needed the conversation to be about leadership, professionalism, and one final serious run. Instead, the conversation became a mugshot. Cleveland, contract pressure, and the mugshot problem. Cleveland was supposed to be the practical chapter, not the peak, not the empire, not the super team dream, just a veteran star trying to help a serious roster make a serious run. Harden did not have to be the best player in the world anymore. He did not even have to be the best version of himself. He only had to be reliable, smart, productive, and steady enough to help the Cavaliers take the next step. That is why the timing of the arrest could not have been worse. The Cavaliers had already seen both sides of the Harden experience. They saw the playmaking, the scoring, the ability to settle a team down when possessions got messy. They also saw the playoff ceiling questions. They saw how a deep run can still end in disappointment. They saw how the conversation around Harden never stays fully on basketball for long. Now, with a contract decision hanging over the summer, Cleveland has to weigh everything at once. Not just points and assists, not just age and health, not just fit. They have to measure perception. They have to ask how fans will react, how ownership will view it, how the locker room processes it, how much guaranteed money makes sense for a player who is still useful, but increasingly surrounded by complications. That is what makes this moment so delicate. Harden's legal case may be resolved without major career consequences, but contract negotiations are not courtrooms. A team does not need a conviction to become cautious. A general manager does not need a scandal to lower an offer. Sometimes all it takes is uncertainty, and the mugshot creates uncertainty. It gives the Cavaliers a reason to pause. It gives other teams a reason to wait. It gives Harden's side one more obstacle at the bargaining table. When a player is 27 and playing like an MVP, teams accept noise. When a player is 36 and already carrying years of reputational baggage, noise becomes expensive. Still, Harden is not finished. That is important. He can still play. He can still help a team win regular season games. He can still be valuable in the right role. But the question is no longer whether James Harden belongs in the NBA. Of course he does. The question is whether a contender can trust him enough to build anything meaningful around him. And after Houston, that question just got harder to answer. The lesson behind Harden's fall, the James Harden story, is not just about basketball anymore. It is about the cost of talent without peace around it. Because Harden's talent was never fake. Nobody can erase the MVP. Nobody can erase the scoring titles. Nobody can erase the nights when defenders looked trapped before he even made his move. He changed the geometry of NBA offense. He turned the step-back three into a signature weapon. He forced coaches, referees, defenders, and analysts to rethink what efficient scoring could look like in the modern game. But legacy is not built only on what a player can do. It is built on what he protects. Relationships, trust, preparation, accountability. The ability to handle disappointment without turning every ending into a fire. That is where Harden's story becomes a warning. A superstar can be great enough to get second chances, third chances, even fourth chances. But every exit leaves a mark. Every public feud leaves a mark. Every playoff disappointment leaves a mark. Every off-court headline leaves a mark. And eventually, the league stops judging the player only by his best nights and starts judging him by the pattern. The Houston arrest may not end Harden's career. It may not even change the legal side of his life in a dramatic way. But symbolically, it matters. It happened in the city where he became a legend. It happened at an age when he needed clarity, not chaos. It happened during a summer when his next contract, his role, and his reputation were all already under review. That is the deeper lesson. Greatness gives you a platform, but discipline decides how long you stand on it. Fame gives you attention, but character decides what that attention becomes. And in professional sports, the margin between still valuable and too risky can become very thin when the years start running out. For Harden, the most human ending would not be another fight, another trade demand, or another bitter headline. It would be acceptance. Accepting a smaller role if that is what winning requires. Accepting that leadership is not control. Accepting that the final chapter of a career does not have to be louder than the first. It can be wiser. Maybe Harden still has one more meaningful run left. Maybe Cleveland or another team gives him that chance. Maybe he responds not with drama, but with maturity. And if that happens, the story does not have to end as a fall. It can end as a lesson about what happens when a brilliant player finally stops chasing comfort and starts protecting peace. But if this is the beginning of goodbye, then it should be remembered honestly. James Harden was spectacular, frustrating, brilliant, complicated, and unforgettable. He gave the NBA moments that will live forever. He also left questions that may never fully go away. Now, I want to hear from you. If you believe Harden still deserves one final shot at a championship run, press 1 in the comments. If you think teams should move on and stop taking the risk, press 2. Tell us where you are watching from. Share this video with another NBA fan. Hit the like button if you want more stories like this, and subscribe to the channel for the next deep dive into the drama behind the game.